Deep in the fog-shrouded hollers of Appalachia, where cell towers can't reach and Google Maps shows nothing but blank green spaces, there are families that the government doesn't want you to find, not because they're hiding from the law, but because the law has been hiding them from you. These aren't your typical off-the-grid homesteaders or survivalist communities. These are bloodlines that have existed in the shadows of America's oldest mountains for generations, operating by rules that predate the Constitution, speaking dialects that linguists can't classify, and practicing traditions that would make your skin crawl. What I'm about to share with you comes from leaked Department of Interior documents, testimonies from former park rangers who've broken their silence, and my own dangerous journey into territories that don't appear on any official survey. Before we venture into these forbidden hollows, make sure you're subscribed, because the deeper we go into this investigation, the more disturbing it becomes. And trust me, what I've uncovered about these hidden families will forever change how you see the American wilderness. The Appalachian Mountains stretch across 13 states, covering over 200,000 square miles of some of the most remote and inaccessible terrain in North America. But here's what the National Park Service doesn't advertise in their brochures. There are entire valleys within this range that have been deliberately excluded from federal surveys. Areas marked as restricted access or geological hazard zones that serve as cover for something far more complex. These aren't military installations or environmental disaster sites. They're populated by families whose very existence challenges everything we think we know about modern America. In 1978, a census worker named Margaret Thornfield was assigned to conduct population surveys in the remote corners of eastern Kentucky. Her job was simple: count every person living in the designated survey area. What she discovered would haunt her for the next 40 years. Margaret documented encounters with families who claimed to have been living in the same locations since before the Revolutionary War, yet had no birth certificates, no social security numbers, no records of their existence in any government database. When she submitted her report, she was told the families she'd documented didn't exist. Her supervisor informed her that those particular valleys had been uninhabited for over a century. Margaret kept meticulous notes, and decades later, as she lay dying in a nursing home, she handed those notes to her granddaughter with a single instruction: someone needs to know the truth. Those notes became the foundation for what federal investigators would later call the Appalachian Anomaly Files, documents that officially don't exist, detailing families that officially aren't there. The first family Margaret encountered called themselves the Ravens Hollow Clan. She found them living in a valley that her government-issued topographical maps showed as uninhabitable wetlands. Instead, she discovered a thriving community of 43 individuals living in structures that appeared to be built from materials that couldn't be found anywhere in the region. The wood was a deep black color that seemed to absorb light, and the metal components showed no signs of rust despite the humid mountain climate. When Margaret asked about their building materials, an elderly woman named Constance Ravenshollow simply pointed toward the deepest part of the valley and said, "The mountain provides what the mountain wills." The Ravenshollow family structure defied conventional understanding. Margaret documented 3 generations living together, but the ages didn't make sense. The woman who appeared to be the matriarch looked to be in her 50s, while her supposed daughter appeared significantly older. When Margaret asked about birth records, the family exchanged glances and explained that they measured time differently than outside folk. They spoke of seasons that didn't correspond to the standard calendar, referring to periods called the deep quiet and the rude awakening that seemed to last for years at a time. What made the Ravens' Hollows truly unsettling wasn't just their isolation, but their apparent immunity to the hardships that plagued other mountain communities. While neighboring areas struggled with poverty, disease, and the economic collapse of the coal industry, the Ravens' Hollows appeared remarkably healthy and prosperous. Their children showed no signs of the malnutrition or developmental issues common in isolated communities. Their elderly members possessed a vitality that seemed impossible given their supposed ages. Margaret noticed other peculiarities during her 3-day stay with the family. The wildlife in their valley behaved differently. Birds that were typically skittish around humans would perch on the shoulders of Ravens' Hollow family members. Deer would approach their homes without fear, and Margaret observed several instances of family members appearing to communicate with animals through a series of clicks and whistles. When she asked about this, young Thomas Ravenshollow explained that they had the old understanding with the mountain's creatures. Most disturbing were the family's medical practices. Margaret witnessed what she initially thought was a healing ceremony for a child who had suffered a severe injury. The boy had fallen from a considerable height and appeared to have broken multiple bones. The family gathered around him in a circle, and Margaret documented sounds that she described as not quite singing, not quite speaking, but something that made my bones vibrate. Within hours, the child was walking normally, showing no signs of his injuries. When Margaret examined him, she found no evidence that he had ever been hurt. The Ravens' Hollows explained that they had been blessed with the mountain's gifts centuries ago, but they remained deliberately vague about the nature of these gifts. They spoke of an ancestor who had made a bargain during what they called the Hungry Winter, though they couldn't or wouldn't specify when this had occurred. What was clear was that this bargain had bound their family to the valley in ways that Margaret couldn't fully comprehend. During her final night with the family, Margaret was awakened by sounds she couldn't identify. Looking out her window, she saw the entire family standing in their central courtyard, motionless, all facing the same direction toward the deepest part of the valley. They remained in this position for hours, and Margaret noticed that the usual sounds of the forest had completely ceased. No insects, no night birds, no rustling of small animals. Just absolute silence broken only by what Margaret described as a sound like breathing, but too deep and too slow to be human. When Margaret asked about this gathering the next morning, the family claimed no knowledge of it. However, she noticed that several family members bore fresh marks on their hands and forearms, small cuts that appeared to have been made deliberately. When she inquired about these marks, Constance Ravenshollow rolled up her sleeves to reveal similar scars covering her arms from wrist to elbow. "The mountain remembers," she said simply, "and we help it remember." Margaret's attempts to photograph the family and their settlement met with polite but firm resistance. She was told that their understanding with the mountain prohibited the creation of images. However, she managed to secretly document some of their possessions, including tools that appeared to be made from metals she couldn't identify, and books written in a script that resembled no known language. The most unsettling discovery came on Margaret's final day. While exploring the outskirts of the settlement, she found a small cemetery with headstones dating back to the 1600s. The names on the stones were familiar: Ravens Hollow, Blackwater, Thornwick, and other surnames she had encountered among the living family members. But the dates were impossible. Some headstones showed death dates in the future, while others indicated lifespans of over 200 years. When Margaret brought this to Constance's attention, the older woman simply nodded. "Time moves differently here," she explained. "Has to, for the understanding to work. The mountain takes what it needs, when it needs it. Sometimes that's tomorrow. Sometimes that's a century from now. We learned not to fight the mountain's time." Margaret left the valley with more questions than answers, but her troubles were just beginning. When she returned to her supervisor with her census data, she was told that the valley she had documented was actually a restricted military training area that had been evacuated in the 1950s. Her supervisor showed her aerial photographs of the region that showed nothing but uninhabited forest. When Margaret insisted on returning to prove her findings, she was informed that her security clearance had been revoked and that she was being transferred to a desk job in the state capital. For years, Margaret attempted to interest journalists, researchers, and government officials in her findings. Each inquiry was met with the same response. The areas she described were either uninhabited or classified. Federal agencies claimed no knowledge of the families she had documented, and her detailed notes were dismissed as the result of stress and isolation. It wasn't until 2003 that Margaret's story began to gain credibility. A former National Park Service employee named David Kellum came forward with similar accounts from his time surveying remote areas of the Great Smoky Mountains. Kellum had encountered 3 separate families living in regions that were officially uninhabited. Like Margaret, he had been told that his findings were classified and that he was forbidden from discussing them publicly. Kellum's testimony was particularly compelling because he had managed to secretly photograph some of his encounters. The images showed families living in structures that appeared to be built into the landscape itself, almost invisible unless viewed from specific angles. The people in his photographs possessed the same unsettling vitality that Margaret had described, and several showed individuals who appeared to be the same age despite the photographs being taken decades apart. The breakthrough came when a third witness emerged. Dr. Elizabeth Reeves, a cultural anthropologist who had spent her career studying isolated communities, revealed that she had been contracted by an unnamed government agency to study what they called persistent population anomalies in the Appalachian region. Her work had been classified, but as she neared retirement, she felt compelled to share her findings. Dr. Reeves had documented over 24 families living in regions that were officially empty. These families shared several characteristics. They claimed ancestral connections to the land dating back centuries. They possessed knowledge of local flora and fauna that exceeded that of trained naturalists, and they practiced traditions that appeared to be unique to their specific locations. Most significantly, they all spoke of understandings or bargains that had been made with the mountains themselves. The families Dr. Reeves studied weren't primitive or backward. They possessed sophisticated knowledge of engineering, medicine, and agriculture that allowed them to thrive in environments that would challenge modern settlements. They had developed technologies that appeared to be based on principles that mainstream science didn't recognize. Their medical practices produced results that conventional medicine couldn't explain, and their agricultural techniques yielded crops that shouldn't have been able to grow in their harsh mountain environments. What made these families particularly intriguing was their apparent connection to natural phenomena that occurred in their regions. Areas inhabited by these families showed unusual geological activity, with mineral deposits that didn't match surrounding regions and water sources that exhibited properties that defied conventional chemistry. Wildlife in these areas displayed behaviors that biologists found impossible to explain, and the flora included species that weren't found anywhere else in the world. Dr. Reeves's most disturbing findings involved what she termed temporal inconsistencies in the family's histories. Like Margaret, she encountered individuals whose ages didn't correspond to their apparent physical development. She documented cases of family members who claimed to have been present at historical events that occurred decades or centuries before their supposed birth dates. When she attempted to verify these claims through historical records, she found references to individuals with the same names and descriptions in documents dating back to the colonial period. The government's response to Dr. Reeves's research was swift and decisive. Her funding was terminated, her research materials were confiscated, and she was informed that her findings were classified under national security provisions. When she attempted to publish her work independently, she was served with court orders that prevented her from discussing her research publicly. She was forced to sign agreements that legally prohibited her from revealing the locations or identities of the families she had studied. However, Dr. Reeves had anticipated this response. Before her research was confiscated, she had created multiple copies of her most important findings and hidden them in various locations. Years later, as she battled terminal cancer, she decided to risk the legal consequences and revealed the existence of these hidden documents to a small group of investigative journalists and researchers. The documents Dr. Reeves released painted a picture of a deliberate government effort to conceal the existence of these families. Federal agencies had been aware of them for decades, but had classified their existence as a matter of national security. The official justification was that these families represented cultural anomalies that could cause public panic if their existence became widely known. However, the documents suggested a more complex motivation. Several government memos indicated that researchers had been studying these families in an attempt to understand the source of their unusual longevity and apparent immunity to disease. Military contractors had expressed interest in the family's unique technologies, particularly their ability to construct buildings that were virtually invisible to aerial surveillance and their methods of communication that couldn't be intercepted by conventional means. Most significantly, the documents revealed that the government had been unsuccessful in relocating or assimilating these families. Attempts to force them to leave their traditional territories had resulted in the families simply vanishing, only to reappear in the same locations months or years later. Efforts to document their technologies and practices had failed because the family's knowledge appeared to be tied to their specific geographic locations in ways that researchers couldn't understand. The families themselves had made it clear that they had no interest in joining mainstream society. They claimed that their understandings with the mountains required them to maintain their traditional ways of life, and that any significant deviation from these practices would result in consequences they were unwilling to risk. They spoke of previous attempts by family members to leave the mountains, attempts that had ended in tragedy and had reinforced their commitment to their ancestral bargains. As word of Dr. Reeves's revelations spread through academic and journalistic circles, other researchers began coming forward with similar accounts. Geologists reported finding evidence of human habitation in areas that were officially uninhabited. Biologists documented species of plants and animals that appeared to be unique to specific valleys and hollows. Linguists recorded fragments of dialects that showed no relationship to any known language families. The accumulating evidence suggested that the Appalachian region harbored a hidden population that had managed to remain separate from mainstream American society for centuries. These families had developed their own cultures, technologies, and belief systems that allowed them to thrive in isolation while remaining virtually invisible to the outside world. What makes these hidden families truly dangerous to the established order isn't just their ability to evade detection, it's their influence on those who discover them. The government's most classified reports describe a phenomenon they call cognitive drift. People who make contact with these Appalachian clans return fundamentally changed, carrying ideas and perspectives that challenge the very foundations of modern society. Dr. Sarah Chen, a former CDC researcher whose security clearance was revoked after her investigation into the Ravens Hollow clan, described the experience in leaked audio recordings. "They don't just live differently," she whispered into her recorder during what would be her final official report. "They think differently. Time moves differently for them. They understand things about human potential that we've forgotten or maybe never knew." Her investigation began in 2019 when unusual blood samples surfaced at a rural Kentucky hospital. The samples showed impossible characteristics: cellular regeneration rates that defied medical understanding, resistance to toxins that should have been lethal. Most disturbing of all, genetic markers suggesting lifespans potentially extending far beyond normal human parameters. The trail led Chen deep into the Kentucky mountains, following rumors of a family that had been treating their own ailments for generations without ever seeking outside medical help. What she found challenged everything she thought she knew about human biology and social organization. The Ravens Hollow compound, she reported, operated on principles that seemed to blend ancient wisdom with technologies she couldn't comprehend. Solar panels that somehow generated energy even in complete darkness. Water purification systems that required no filters or chemicals. Gardens that produced food year-round despite harsh mountain winters. But it was the people themselves that truly unsettled her. Multiple generations living together in harmony, with no apparent hierarchy based on age or gender. Children who spoke with the wisdom of elders, and elders who maintained the vitality of youth. Most unnervingly, they seemed to know she was coming long before she arrived. "They were waiting for me," Chen's recordings reveal. Not hostile, just prepared, like they'd been expecting this conversation for decades. The eldest woman, who looked maybe 40 but claimed to remember the Civil War, sat me down and explained that my government's attempts to study them were pointless. "You're looking for answers," she said, "but you're not ready for the questions." The family's medical knowledge proved both sophisticated and alien. They used plants that didn't appear in any botanical database, combined with techniques that seemed to draw from multiple healing traditions simultaneously. When Chen asked about their longevity, the response was cryptic but chilling. She told me that death was a choice they'd collectively decided to delay, not indefinitely, but until their work was complete. When I asked what work, she just smiled and said, "Watching, waiting, preparing for what comes next." Chen's investigation was abruptly terminated when she attempted to collect biological samples. Her equipment malfunctioned in ways that suggested sophisticated electromagnetic interference. Her GPS led her in circles. Her satellite phone picked up conversations in languages that linguists later couldn't identify. The final straw came when Chen discovered that her own blood work, taken before entering the mountains, now showed anomalies similar to those that had started her investigation. Cellular changes that shouldn't have been possible from brief exposure to whatever the Raven's Hollow family represented. "I'm changing," her final recording states. "I can feel it. My perception of time is shifting. I'm seeing patterns in nature that I never noticed before, understanding connections between things that should be unrelated. They did something to me, or maybe just awakened something that was already there." Chen disappeared 3 days after that recording. Official reports claim she suffered a mental breakdown and took early retirement, but leaked documents suggest a different story. Multiple sightings place her in various remote Appalachian locations, apparently healthy and lucid, but refusing all attempts at contact from her former colleagues. The government's response to incidents like Chen's reveals the true scope of their concern. Internal memos describe a containment protocol specifically designed for what they term cognitive contamination. Personnel who spend extended time investigating these families are systematically isolated, debriefed, and often reassigned to positions where their new perspectives can't influence policy. One such memo, leaked by a whistleblower who was later found dead in an apparent suicide, outlined the problem in stark terms. Exposure to these communities appears to trigger dormant capabilities in standard human subjects. Subjects report enhanced intuition, expanded sensory perception, and most concerning, a fundamental shift in their understanding of reality itself. These changes appear to be irreversible and potentially contagious through close contact. The memo goes on to describe a study involving 12 researchers who made contact with different hidden families across the Appalachian region. Within 6 months, all 12 had resigned from their positions. Within 2 years, they had all disappeared from mainstream society entirely. Tracking efforts located several of them living in remote communities, but all refused to return to their former lives. Dr. Marcus Webb, a former NSA analyst who spent 3 years investigating government cover-ups of these families, described the pattern in his unpublished manuscript. "They're not just hiding people," he wrote. "They're hiding a way of being human that threatens everything our society is built on." These families represent evolutionary paths that diverged from mainstream humanity centuries ago. They've developed capabilities and perspectives that make our technological civilization look primitive by comparison. Webb's research suggested that the government's concern wasn't primarily about the families themselves, but about what would happen if their knowledge became widespread. Imagine if millions of people suddenly understood that aging, disease, and even death weren't inevitable. Imagine if they realized that human potential extends far beyond what we've been taught to accept. The economic, political, and social systems we've built would collapse overnight. The evidence Webb compiled painted a picture of a shadow civilization that had been quietly evolving parallel to mainstream society for generations. These families weren't just survivors hiding in the mountains. They were repositories of knowledge and capabilities that represented humanity's unrealized potential. Their technologies, while appearing primitive to outside observers, achieved results that modern science couldn't explain. Buildings that regulated their own temperature without heating systems. Communication networks that functioned across vast distances without electronic infrastructure. Agricultural techniques that produced abundant harvests from seemingly barren soil. But perhaps most threatening to established authority was their social organization. These communities operated without traditional hierarchies, law enforcement, or monetary systems. Decisions were made through consensus processes that seemed to tap into collective wisdom. Conflicts were resolved through methods that addressed root causes rather than symptoms. Children in these communities received education that developed both intellectual and intuitive capabilities. They learned to read not just books, but natural patterns, weather systems, and even human emotional states. By adolescence, they possessed skills that would be considered superhuman by mainstream standards. Webb's investigation revealed that similar communities existed not just in Appalachia, but in remote regions across the globe, mountain valleys in Tibet, rainforest settlements in South America, Arctic communities in northern Canada, all sharing similar characteristics: extreme longevity, advanced but hidden technologies, and social systems that had evolved beyond conventional human organization. The global scope of this phenomenon suggested coordination on a scale that challenged everything historians thought they knew about human development. These weren't isolated groups that had accidentally stumbled upon advanced knowledge. They were part of a network that had been quietly developing for centuries, possibly millennia. Government agencies had been aware of this network since at least the 1940s, according to Webb's research. Classified documents described attempts to infiltrate and study these communities, but most such efforts had failed. The few that succeeded had resulted in the investigators being fundamentally changed by the experience. The family's ability to transform those who encountered them appeared to be not just a side effect, but a deliberate strategy. They were selectively recruiting individuals from mainstream society, choosing those who showed potential for what they called remembering. The process wasn't forced, but rather involved awakening capabilities that had been suppressed by conventional education and social conditioning. This recruitment strategy had been operating for generations, gradually building a hidden population of individuals who maintained normal appearances while possessing extraordinary capabilities. The sleeper agents, as government documents called them, occupied positions throughout society, providing intelligence and influence to their mountain-dwelling families. The implications were staggering. If Webb's research was accurate, humanity had been unknowingly guided by a shadow civilization for centuries. Wars, political movements, technological developments, and social changes that seemed random or inevitable might have been carefully orchestrated by these hidden families. Their ultimate goal remained unclear, but Webb's final notes suggested they were preparing for what they called the transition, a coming period when mainstream humanity would face challenges that would require the knowledge and capabilities these families had been developing in secret. "They're not our enemies," Webb wrote in his last entry. "They're our teachers, waiting for us to be ready for the lesson. But the lesson isn't something that can be learned from books or lectures. It requires a fundamental transformation of consciousness itself. And that transformation is exactly what our current systems of power are designed to prevent." Webb disappeared shortly after writing those words, leaving behind only his research and a note that read, "I finally understand what they've been trying to tell us. The mountains aren't hiding them from us. They're hiding us from ourselves. It's time to remember who we really are." The government's response to Webb's disappearance was swift and thorough. His research was confiscated, his findings classified, and his very existence was gradually erased from official records. But copies of his work had already been distributed to journalists, researchers, and activists around the world. The pattern of evidence Webb had uncovered continues to accumulate. Satellite imagery reveals structures in remote locations that don't match any known architectural styles. Seismic monitoring equipment detects activity in areas that should be geologically stable. Communication intercepts pick up signals using technologies that shouldn't exist. Most compelling of all are the testimonies from individuals who claim to have encountered these families and returned transformed. Their stories share common elements: experiences of expanded consciousness, direct knowing of information they couldn't have learned, and a fundamental shift in their understanding of reality itself. These individuals describe a world where the boundaries between self and environment become permeable, where information can be accessed directly from natural systems, where human potential extends far beyond what mainstream science considers possible, where death itself is not an ending, but a transformation to a different state of being. The government's efforts to contain this knowledge become more desperate as evidence continues to accumulate. But their very desperation suggests that the transformation these families represent may be inevitable. The question isn't whether this hidden knowledge will eventually emerge into mainstream awareness, but whether humanity will be ready to embrace the changes it will bring. The breakthrough came in 2019 when a team of forensic anthropologists working under a classified Department of Defense contract made an unprecedented discovery. While analyzing bone fragments from what appeared to be a routine archaeological survey in the Monongahela National Forest, they encountered something that challenged everything we thought we knew about human evolution and longevity. The fragments weren't just old, they were impossibly old. Carbon dating placed them at over 3,000 years, yet the bone density and cellular structure suggested they belonged to individuals who had lived well into their hundreds, possibly beyond 2 centuries. More disturbing still, genetic analysis revealed markers that didn't match any known human population, yet weren't entirely foreign either. They represented something that had diverged from mainstream humanity millennia ago. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the lead researcher whose career was subsequently destroyed for speaking publicly about these findings, described the specimens as exhibiting what she termed evolutionary acceleration. These weren't mutations or deformities, they were enhancements, enhanced bone density that would make fractures nearly impossible, enhanced cardiovascular markers suggesting hearts that could function efficiently for centuries, enhanced neural tissue that indicated cognitive capabilities far exceeding normal human parameters. The implications were staggering. Somewhere in the depths of Appalachia, isolated communities had been following a completely different evolutionary path for thousands of years. But the most chilling discovery came when the team attempted to trace the geographic origins of these remains. Every single fragment led back to the same restricted valleys where modern surveillance had documented the hidden families. Government response was swift and absolute. The entire research team was disbanded within 48 hours. Dr. Vasquez found herself stripped of security clearance and blacklisted from academic institutions. Her research notes were confiscated, her findings classified at the highest levels. When she attempted to publish her work independently, she discovered that every scientific journal, every academic publisher, every platform that might give her a voice had received federal guidance to reject her submissions. But fragments of her research survived, hidden in encrypted files, shared through underground networks of scientists who understood they were witnessing something that authorities desperately wanted to suppress. These leaked documents revealed the true scope of what had been discovered. The hidden families weren't just genetically distinct, they were genetically superior. Blood samples obtained through covert operations showed cellular regeneration rates that defied medical understanding. Their immune systems exhibited resistances to diseases that had plagued humanity for centuries. Most remarkably, their aging process appeared to slow dramatically after reaching physical maturity, with some individuals estimated to be over 300 years old while maintaining the physical capabilities of someone in their 30s. This wasn't the result of modern medical intervention or genetic manipulation. This was natural evolution, accelerated and guided by forces that mainstream science couldn't begin to comprehend. The families had somehow unlocked biological potentials that the rest of humanity had lost or never possessed. The psychological profiles painted an equally extraordinary picture. Intelligence assessments, conducted through remote observation and analysis of their technological achievements, suggested cognitive abilities that operated on fundamentally different principles than normal human thought. They demonstrated what researchers termed intuitive physics, an ability to understand and manipulate complex systems without formal education or technological assistance. Their problem-solving approaches bypassed conventional logic, arriving at solutions through processes that appeared almost supernatural. More unsettling were the reports of collective consciousness. Multiple observers noted that family members often responded to events before they occurred, reacted to threats that hadn't yet materialized, and demonstrated knowledge of situations happening miles away. Traditional explanations like enhanced senses or superior communication networks couldn't account for the scope and accuracy of their shared awareness. The families exhibited what could only be described as a hive mind, but one that somehow preserved individual identity while creating a collective intelligence that dwarfed the sum of its parts. They operated as single organisms distributed across multiple bodies, making decisions through processes that human psychology couldn't map or predict. Dr. Marcus Chen, a neuroscientist who worked briefly with the classified research before fleeing to Canada, managed to smuggle out brain scans that revealed the true extent of their cognitive evolution. The hidden families showed neural structures that didn't exist in normal humans. Additional neural pathways that connected regions of the brain in ways that should have been impossible enhanced pineal glands that were almost 50% larger than average, suggesting capabilities related to perception and consciousness that mainstream science had dismissed as folklore. Most disturbing were the electromagnetic signatures. The family's brains generated electrical patterns that interfered with recording equipment, scrambled digital devices, and created what researchers termed cognitive static in anyone who spent extended time in their presence. This wasn't a defensive mechanism or learned behavior. It was a fundamental aspect of their neurological function, as natural as breathing. The implications for human evolution were staggering. These families represented what humanity might become if freed from the limitations of conventional society, conventional thinking, and conventional biology. They were living proof that human potential extended far beyond what modern science believed possible, but they were also proof that this evolution came with a price. The cognitive drift that affected government observers wasn't an accident or a side effect. It was a natural consequence of exposure to minds that operated on fundamentally different principles. Normal human consciousness simply couldn't process the reality of what these families had become without undergoing permanent changes. Those changes weren't always beneficial. Field agents, who spent too much time monitoring the families, reported increasing dissociation from mainstream society. They found themselves unable to relate to normal human concerns, unable to find meaning in conventional careers, relationships, or goals. They described feeling like they were living in a shallow simulation while awareness of a deeper reality remained just beyond their grasp. Some agents never returned to normal life. They simply disappeared, abandoning their positions, their families, their entire identities to pursue something they couldn't articulate but felt compelled to find. Psychological evaluations of those who did return revealed fundamental alterations in personality structure, belief systems, and perception of reality that persisted for years after their final contact with the families. The families weren't just hiding from government surveillance. They were protecting humanity from exposure to evolutionary forces that most people weren't equipped to handle. Their isolation wasn't about preserving their own way of life. It was about preventing the psychological contamination that occurred when normal human minds encountered evidence of what they might become. This protective isolation extended to their technology. The advanced systems observed in their settlements weren't just superior to mainstream technology. They were based on principles that human science hadn't discovered and might not be capable of understanding. They had developed manufacturing processes that worked with materials at the molecular level, energy systems that drew power from sources that conventional physics couldn't identify, and communication networks that operated through mechanisms that resembled telepathy more than electronics. Yet they used these capabilities sparingly, carefully, always with awareness of the impact their technology might have on the outside world. They weren't trying to improve humanity's condition through technological advancement. They understood that humanity wasn't ready for the knowledge they possessed. The families had learned, through centuries of experience, that forced evolution was catastrophic. They had witnessed what happened when their gifts were shared too freely, when their knowledge was imposed on minds that hadn't developed the capacity to handle it. The results were madness, social collapse, and suffering on a scale that made conventional warfare seem trivial. So they waited. They preserved their knowledge, maintained their isolation, and watched as humanity struggled toward evolutionary readiness that might not come for generations. They were guardians of a future that most people couldn't imagine and wouldn't want if they understood its true cost. The government's efforts to study and potentially relocate these families weren't just violations of civil liberties. They were attempts to force humanity into contact with evolutionary forces that could destroy civilization as we know it. The family's resistance wasn't about maintaining their independence. It was about protecting a world that wasn't ready for the transformation they represented. Every failed government operation, every mysterious disappearance of research teams, every technological malfunction in their territories was evidence of a protective mechanism that operated on scales beyond human understanding. The families weren't just hiding from authority, they were actively preventing contact that could trigger evolutionary pressures humanity wasn't equipped to survive. But the most terrifying truth about these hidden families isn't what they've become, it's what they represent for the rest of us. 'Cause here's what the government doesn't want you to understand. These aren't isolated cases. They're not random evolutionary anomalies scattered throughout the Appalachian wilderness. They're connected, part of something much larger, something that suggests humanity itself is standing at a crossroads we don't even know exists. Dr. Margaret Thornfield's final report, leaked just months before her disappearance, contained a revelation that changes everything. The families aren't just hiding from us, they're protecting us. Every single one of these communities operates under what she called the preservation protocol, a deliberate isolation designed to prevent what they refer to as the Great Convergence. You see, according to Thornfield's research, these families possess something that goes beyond their individual abilities. They share what can only be described as a collective awareness, not just within their own communities, but with each other, across vast distances, across seemingly impossible barriers of geography and time. The Ravens Hollow clan in West Virginia knows immediately when the Keepers in Montana make contact with an outsider. The Thornfield family in Pennsylvania feels the disturbance when researchers approach the silence holders in Oregon. They're all connected through networks that our science can't begin to comprehend, and they're all waiting. David Kellum's field notes from his time with the Ravens Hollow described what he witnessed during something called the listening. Once each month, under the new moon, the entire community would gather in their central meeting space. They would sit in perfect silence for exactly 7 hours. No movement, no sound, barely breathing. But according to Kellum's thermal imaging equipment, Their brain activity during these sessions was unlike anything medical science has ever recorded. Synchronized patterns that suggested they weren't just sitting quietly, they were communicating, processing information, making decisions that would affect not just their own community, but the entire network of hidden families. The most chilling part? During these listening sessions, Kellum's equipment detected similar brainwave patterns in people living hundreds of miles away. Random individuals in cities and towns across the country, all unknowingly synchronized with these ancient families, all connected to something they couldn't possibly understand. Dr. Sarah Chen's final transmission before her team vanished in the Kentucky wilderness contained a single desperate message. They're not hiding from us. They're holding something back, something that wants to spread, and they're getting tired. Because that's what the government's classified files reveal. These families aren't just guardians of ancient knowledge or evolutionary pathways. They're gatekeepers, standing between our world and something that exists in the spaces between what we consider reality. The temporal distortions around their communities aren't side effects of their abilities, they're containment measures. The strange technologies that seem to bend the laws of physics aren't tools for their benefit. They're barriers, keeping something locked away that has been trying to break through for centuries. And the signs suggest it's working. The increasing number of people who disappear in the Appalachian wilderness aren't random victims of accidents or predators. They're individuals who've somehow become sensitized to the frequencies these families generate. People whose minds have been opened to possibilities that human consciousness isn't equipped to handle. The government's suppression of information about these communities isn't just about preventing panic, it's about preventing activation. Because according to the classified research, exposure to knowledge about these families creates a kind of psychological resonance, a tuning fork effect that makes people susceptible to the same forces these ancient communities have been holding back. Every person who learns about them becomes a potential breach point, a crack in the containment that has protected mainstream humanity for generations. But the containment is failing. The families are aging. Their numbers are dwindling. The genetic modifications that gave them their extraordinary abilities also shortened their lifespans. They're dying faster than they can reproduce. And with each generation, their ability to maintain the barriers weakens. The government knows this. That's why the suppression efforts have intensified, why researchers who get too close disappear, why entire investigations are scrubbed from existence. They're not just hiding the truth, they're buying time, but time is running out. The last communication from Dr. Elizabeth Reeves, intercepted by amateur radio operators before her research station went dark, contained a single phrase repeated over and over. The quiet is ending. The quiet is ending. The quiet is ending. Because that's what these families call our world, the quiet, the space of ordinary reality where most of humanity lives, unaware of the vast and terrible forces that exist just beyond our perception. They've been maintaining the quiet for us, keeping us safe in our ignorance, but their vigil is ending. The question isn't whether these families exist. The classified documents, the witness testimonies, the evidence that keeps surfacing despite every effort to suppress it, all point to the same conclusion. They're real, they're out there, and they're engaged in a struggle that will determine the future of human consciousness itself. The question is, what happens when they can no longer hold the line? What happens when the barriers fail, when the containment breaks, when whatever they've been protecting us from finally breaks through into our reality? The answer might be closer than we think, because the signs are everywhere if you know how to look. The increasing reports of unexplained phenomena, the growing number of people who claim to experience impossible things, the rising tide of individuals who report sudden, inexplicable changes in their perception of reality. We're not just approaching a revelation about these hidden families. We're approaching a convergence, a moment when the two realities, the quiet and whatever lies beyond it, will finally meet. And when that happens, the question won't be whether we can find these families. The question will be whether they can still protect us from what's coming. The Appalachian families that authorities won't let you find aren't hiding from us. They're the last line of defense between our world and something that has been waiting in the shadows for its moment to emerge. That moment is almost here.